Imagine you are handed a comprehensive, brilliant guidebook to life. I mean, it has the answers to your biggest problems, your relationships, your finances, your sense of purpose.
Right.
But instead of actually reading it to understand the instructions, you and everyone around you just focus on speed reading it aloud in a language you don't even speak.
Yeah, it creates this really bizarre paradox.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have competition to see who can flip through the pages the fastest. And you repeat phrases from it thousands of times a day without ever knowing what they actually mean.
You're holding the manual, you're interacting with it constantly, but you're completely blind to the instructions. I mean, you would never learn how to actually build or fix anything in your life that way.
And that tension right there is the core of our deep dive today. Welcome in, everyone. We are exploring a really fascinating theological and historical document titled Qur'an-Centered Dialogue.
It's a heavy text, for sure.
Oh, totally. It takes a massive magnifying glass to the gulf between mechanical religious rituals and the intense demand for deep intellectual reflection that is actually written inside the Qur'an itself.
But before we really get into the weeds here, it is definitely worth noting that this document wades into some heavily debated historical and theological waters.
Yeah, we need to set the stage on that.
Right, because it critiques the actions of early Islamic dynasties, it analyzes the political collection of the Hadith, and it challenges a lot of mainstream interpretations of faith.
Which means we need to set our usual ground rules for this deep dive. We aren't here to arbitrate centuries of Islamic history, take sides, or, endorse these specific left-wing or right-wing views.
Exactly, we're just laying it out.
We are simply acting as your impartial guides today. We just want to unpack the fascinating arguments and the historical perspectives contained within this specific text so you can evaluate them entirely for yourself.
And our mission today is to follow the source's central argument, which is that the true original message of the Qur'an has historically been beclouded by ancient politics and hollow rituals.
Beclouded is such a great word for it.
It really is. We're going to look at what this text claims happens when believers strip all of that away and return to the Qur'an, not as some mystical talisman, but as a literal manual for critical thinking, ethics, and social justice.
Okay, let's unpack this. The document grounds this entire argument in a very heavy Arabic word, which is majran.
Right, meaning abandoned.
Abandoned, yes.
Yeah.
It points to Surah Al-Furqan, verse 30, where the Prophet Muhammad makes this stark complaint to God, saying that his people have taken the Qur'an as something abandoned. But the text makes it really clear this doesn't mean leaving a physical book on a dusty shelf.
No, far from it. I mean, classical scholars like Ibn Kathir are brought in by the source to explain the underlying mechanism of this abandonment.
And that's not what you'd expect.
Not at all. It isn't just about failing to recite the words. Abandonment means not believing its core message, failing to reflect on its meaning, and refusing to implement its laws in society.
So you could be holding the book, staring right at the pages, reading it aloud every single day, and still be actively abandoning it.
Exactly. And that leads to a really powerful critique of modern practices in the text, what it describes as a drowning out phenomenon.
Right, the mass Qanam competitions.
Yeah, where people race to complete a full recitation of the entire Qur'an in a matter of days. Or the practice of repeating a noble phrase like La ilaha illallah thousands of times on a rosary.
While the mind is completely checked out. Like you're literally thinking about what's for dinner while you're saying it.
Right. The ritual completely overtakes the reflection. It's the triumph of quantity over quality.
It's like speed reading a complex software manual without actually turning on the computer and then wondering why your operating system keeps crashing every day.
That's a great way to put it.
But I have to play devil's advocate for a second on behalf of the listener here. If someone is dedicating 3 hours a night to recitation, if they are spending their entire evening in prayer, calling that abandonment feels incredibly harsh.
It does.
That takes immense discipline.
It undeniably takes discipline. But the fundamental question this text asks is discipline toward what end? The Qur'an itself constantly pushes the concept of tadabbur.
Which means?
It means deep, deliberate reflection. The argument here is that the divine never commands meaningless, robotic repetition. In fact, if you look at the historical practice of the Prophet himself, it was the exact opposite of a speed reading competition.
Oh, right. The text mentions reports from his wife, Salama.
Yes, exactly. She reported that he would recite incredibly slowly, pausing at every single verse, sometimes breaking it down letter by letter, just to absorb the weight of the words.
Wow, letter by letter.
Yeah, and there are accounts of him repeating just one single verse all night long, wrestling with its implications. The idea that you should prioritize how much you read over how well you understand it is framed here as a later cultural accretion.
Oh, cultural accretion.
Yeah, it's a form of ghafla, which translates to heedlessness.
So you're performing the physical mechanics, but your intellect and your heart are entirely absent.
And when the heart is absent, the transformative power of the text just vanishes. You're left with a workout for your vocal cords, not a shint in your worldview.
Which is such a striking image. And if treating the text like a mindless ritual is the ultimate tragedy in this framework, it explains why the document tackles the language barrier so aggressively.
Oh, the language barrier section is fascinating.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because there is this heartbreaking anecdote in the reading about a 5-year-old child.
Mm.
And this child literally believed that God only understands Arabic.
Right.
Because of that, the kid thought he couldn't pray or talk to God just because he didn't know the language.
And that perfectly illustrates the psychological damage of these cultural accretions. The text tackles this head-on and completely dismantles the idea of an exclusive heavenly language.
It's just a myth.
According to the source, yes. It emphatically points out that there is no authentic, reliable tradition claiming Arabic is the language of paradise.
That raises an obvious question, though. I mean, if it's not a magical heavenly language, why was this specific text revealed in Arabic?
The answer the text provides is entirely practical. The document quotes verse 14.4, which states that prophets were sent speaking the language of their specific people simply for the sake of clarity.
So it was just practical communication.
Exactly. Arabic was chosen because the initial 7th century audience spoke Arabic. The goal was immediate comprehension. It was never meant to become some mystical, incomprehensible barrier for a non-Arabic speaker in Indonesia or Detroit centuries later.
The psychology of that is really fascinating to me. Human beings seem to naturally gravitate toward mysticism.
Oh, for sure.
Like, we want our sacred texts to sound like magic spells because it feels more profound than just plain, actionable instructions. But the text gives a very practical breakdown of how this applies to everyday life, especially regarding supplication or dua.
It draws a very clear line there. The formal, structural 5 daily prayers, the Salah, have specific Arabic forms.
Right, the standardized prayers.
Right, and the utility of that is maintaining a unified community practice. If you walk into a mosque anywhere in the world, you know exactly what is happening. But personal supplication outside of those 5 prayers is a totally different mechanism.
The command there is to literally pour your heart out in your mother tongue.
Because the sincerity of the heart is the entire point. I mean, if you are reciting a long prayer of supplication in a language you don't actually speak, you aren't communicating your needs or your fears or your gratitude.
You're just making sounds.
Exactly. You are just making sounds.
This is a tough pill to swallow for some, I think. Because in a lot of Western contexts, we're subtly taught that faith means shutting off your brain. You take a leap in the dark, you ignore your doubts, and you just blindly believe. But this framework seems to demand the exact opposite of that.
It actively condemns blind faith. The text introduces the Quranic concept of takwil, which is the active use of reason and intellect.
Takwil.
Right. In this view, faith without reason isn't faith at all. It's taqlid, which means blind imitation. You're just copying what your parents or your culture did without critically evaluating it.
And there is a striking quote from Surah Al-Araf, verse 179, that reinforces how aggressively the text attacks blind imitation.
Oh, the livestock verse.
Yes. It describes people who have hearts but do not understand, eyes but do not see, ears but do not hear. And it concludes that these people are like livestock. Rather, they are more astray.
The analogy of livestock is incredibly deliberate here. Classical commentary unpacks why humans who don't use reason are considered worse than animals.
Wait, worse than animals? How so?
Well, a sheep or a cow is at least fulfilling its natural purpose by following its instincts, right? It's using the tools it was given. But human beings were given the unique, elevated gift of intellect.
So to have that processing power and actively choose to leave it dormant to just chew the cud and follow the herd is a betrayal of human nature.
It's the ultimate tragedy in this theological framework. You are refusing to use the very tool designed to help you recognize truth.
Okay, this brings us to a massive historical pivot in our deep dive.
Yeah, the politics.
Right. If the original source material was this demanding about critical thinking, comprehension, and avoiding blind ritual, how did we get here?
It's the big question.
How did a movement founded on deep intellectual reflection become, for so many, an exercise in mechanical repetition? The document places the blame squarely on politics.
And when you look closely at history, sweeping theological shifts are almost always driven by political survival. The text points us to the Umayyad dynasty, which ruled the Islamic Empire from 651 to 750 CE.
Okay, so a very early dynasty.
Right. And according to the source, this era was defined by two things: the institutionalization of Arab supremacy and the active, state-sponsored marginalization of the Prophet's own family, specifically his cousin and son-in-law, Ali.
But how does a ruling dynasty actually pull that off? I mean, how do you change the focus of an entire religion just to keep your political rivals out of power?
You do it through the bureaucracy of scholarship. The text details how the Umayyads essentially weaponized the hadith.
The hadith being the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet.
Exactly, passed down through chains of narrators. The rulers realized that the Qur'an itself, with its relentless demands for justice, equity, and holding leaders accountable, was a literal threat to their absolute power.
So they needed a counterbalance to the Qur'an.
They needed a parallel legal structure. The source claims that rulers like Muawiyah actively funded and favored individuals who would narrate hadiths that legitimized the state.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, like elevating figures like Abu Huraira, who provided narrations emphasizing total obedience to the ruler, even if that ruler was unjust or corrupt.
Wow. It's the ancient equivalent of a corrupt corporation burying you in thousands of pages of convoluted terms and conditions.
That is exactly what it is.
They take a clear, empowering constitution, the Quran, and they bury it under millions of micro-regulations. Eventually, the citizens are so overwhelmed trying to figure out which foot to step into the bathroom with, they completely forget that they have the right to demand economic justice from their leaders.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the exact mechanism of what the text calls beclouding.
Beclouding.
By creating this massive, sprawling secondary corpus of law, the rulers give themselves incredible flexibility. They could cherry-pick rules, elevate compliant scholars, silence dissenters, all while claiming religious authority.
And the ultimate effect was neutralizing the Qur'an's liberating anti-authoritarian message.
Exactly. And people saw this happening in real time.
Right, the document mentions early giants of Islamic scholarship pushing back against this, didn't it?
Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Malik, two of the most foundational legal scholars in history, are cited as warning against this very danger.
What were they worried about specifically?
They were deeply concerned that the sheer volume of hadith would overwhelm and overshadow the primary text. They recognize that once you introduce a parallel source of divine authority, human manipulation just becomes inevitable.
Wait, I'm stuck on something here. If a modern believer reads this document and decides to strip away all these historical, politically tainted traditions, how do they actually practice the religion?
It's the most common critique of this approach.
Right, because the Quran says to pray, and it says to fast, but it doesn't give you the step-by-step physical mechanics. Does the source argue you just make it up?
The document navigates this by drawing a very sharp line between types of tradition. It doesn't throw out history entirely. Instead, it distinguishes between isolated written fabrications and what it calls the mass-transmitted sunnah.
Let's define sunnah here for clarity, because that gets thrown around a lot.
Simply put, the sunnah is the lived physical practice of the Prophet and the early community. The text argues that things like the physical mechanics of the 5 daily prayers, or the specific 2.5% rate of zakah, the mandatory charity.
Right.
Those weren't preserved because one guy whispered a secret to a scribe 50 years later.
They were practiced by thousands of people simultaneously 5 times a day out in the open.
Exactly. It's like learning to breathe or walk. It's living, continuous history passed from parents to children across entire societies. The source accepts this mass-transmitted physical sunnah.
So what's the golden rule here?
Accept the undeniable living practice, but reject any written hadith or historical claim that contradicts, adds a new burden to, or obscures the clear principles laid out in the Quran.
So what does this all mean? When you use that filter, when you clear away the obscuring cloud of imperial politics, the text argues you are left with a shockingly practical, almost secular-sounding framework for society.
Totally. The appendices of this document list the socioeconomic blueprints found directly in the Quran, and the mechanics of it are fascinating.
The economic model alone is a radical departure from both modern capitalism and historical feudalism.
Right. For example, it highlights the Quran's absolute prohibition of riba, which is usury or interest.
Which fundamentally changes how society functions. Because if I loan you money with interest, I get richer, even if your business fails. The risk is entirely on you.
Right, and that inherently shifts wealth upward, crushing the poor under debt. The Quran replaces this with a strict profit-sharing model.
How does that work in practice?
Well, if I invest in your business, we share the risk. If you succeed, we both profit. If you fail, we share the loss. It forces the wealthy to be genuinely invested in the success of the working class.
The document also points out that the longest single verse in the entire Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 282, isn't about angels or theology at all.
No, not at all.
It's a painstaking, detailed mandate, demanding written contracts with witnesses for any financial debt. It is literal contract law embedded in a sacred text to prevent exploitation.
And that economic equity bleeds directly into its social justice mandates. The text details the fierce protection of orphans' wealth, the strict requirement to pay fair wages before the worker's sweat dries.
And the harsh condemnations for the wealthy who hoard gold and silver while the community suffers.
Exactly.
There is an ethical standard highlighted here that really blew me away. Surah 4, verse 135, commands believers to stand firm in justice, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, or your relatives.
That is an unimaginably high bar.
I mean, in a tribal society, or frankly, in our modern hyper-partisan society, it leaves zero room for political favoritism or covering up for your allies.
Which brings this entire deep dive full circle. Look at that standard of absolute objective justice, and then look back at the Umayyad emperors.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
If your entire dynasty is built on tribal supremacy, crushing your political rivals, and hoarding state wealth, a primary text demanding objective justice and economic equity is an existential threat.
You literally have to distract the public with endless debates over ritual minutiae, or they will eventually use the book to overthrow you.
Precisely. And to help the modern listener cut through that historical distraction, the source ends with a highly practical application.
The 22-minute daily study plan.
Yes. It's brilliantly simple because it completely removes the pressure of quantity. It recommends spending just 5 minutes reciting a passage to establish a sincere connection.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Then, crucially, 10 minutes reading a translation or scholarly commentary to actually understand the mechanics of what you just read.
Then 5 minutes reflecting on how it applies to your specific life, your finances, your relationships.
And finally, 2 minutes making sincere supplication in your own native language, asking for the strength to implement it. 22 minutes.
That's incredibly doable.
If you do that consistently, the text argues, you aren't just inheriting a set of mechanical habits from your culture. You are actively building a rational, ethical worldview.
To summarize this journey for everyone listening, we started with the Prophet's own warning of a guidebook left unread by the very people holding it.
We unpacked the psychological myth that the divine only speaks one language.
Right. We looked at the mechanics of how early empires weaponized secondary texts to bury demands for justice. And we arrived at this document's ultimate solution, a direct, fiercely rational engagement with an ethical blueprint for life.
If there is a core takeaway from analyzing this source, it's that true faith is not a passive state. It demands your intellect.
It really does.
It requires you to use your reason, to interrogate the traditions you are handed, and to engage deeply with meaning. In this framework, checking your brain at the door isn't piety. It's a profound ungratefulness for the intellect you were given.
The text warns so severely against gafla, the heedlessness of having eyes but refusing to see, having a mind but refusing to reason. And that brings me back to where we started.
Yeah. If active, critical reflection is a moral duty when reading a sacred text, think about how that applies to your everyday life. Consider the endless stream of information you consume daily. The news articles you skim, the algorithms feeding you content, the terms and conditions you blindly accept.
Right.
Are you actively engaging with this information to understand it, to challenge your own biases, to find what's actually true? Or are you just mechanically scrolling through the pages, completely checked out, abandoning the very intellect that makes you human? Something I'm all over today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.